Well, y'all, thanks for coming out tonight. We're going to have a very light crowd. I don't know what I was thinking, not taking into consideration that this was spring break this week here at CPA. So it's just going to be a very intimate gathering of us tonight. But we're going to have fun because what I thought we would do tonight in talking about Screwtape letters, and if you brought a copy, we can read through some of it together, and I want to read a few of the letters. They're very, very short, and I'll make some comments along the way to kind of help you understand what was going on historically, contextually with Lewis. But you know, we covered last fall, or earlier in our first section last fall, the life and thought of Lewis, generally speaking, really his biography. And I've mentioned a few of the things that we've talked about over this semester as we looked at the Ransom series, the Chronicles of Narnia, Mere Christianity the last couple of weeks, and then tonight and next week, the Screwtape letters. And it may seem strange that we're ending with Screwtape letters rather than Mere Christianity, because he began the Screwtape letters before Mere Christianity. But as we're going to see tonight, the radio broadcast talks that comprised Mere Christianity began while he was still writing the weekly letters that became the Screwtape letters. And so if you think about Lewis making it in America, and we said last semester that what really broke him in America was the popularity of the Screwtape letters. Now it's interesting because Lewis would have wanted to have been known in terms of his literary prowess for things like Perelandra or Till We Have Faces, which probably do kind of rise to the top of his literary powers. Screwtape is the opposite. It is very, very pop level. It's very accessible. It is not Lewis at his literary best, and yet that's probably the thing. At least it's arguable that or Narnia are the things for which he's most widely known, and certainly was the thing that became the sort of catalyst for his public persona as an apologist, as a public intellectual on both sides of the Atlantic. And it was one of the things, you'll recall last semester, that prevented him in part from being assigned a chair at Oxford, because they didn't want to give a chair at Oxford to somebody who was one of those Jesus guys, and certainly somebody who had written things like the Screwtape letters and children's books. They just weren't going to risk their reputation on that. Of course, he spent about 9.5 years as a chair of English at Cambridge toward the end of his life, really the last decade of his life. But it was the Screwtape letters that just blew the lid off and brought him into such public recognition. We talked last fall about how in the States, even those like Joy Davidman, who eventually became his wife, become aware of him because of his public theology, his reputation as a public intellectual. And it was really Screwtape that opened the doors for that. And it was Screwtape, and I actually have a first edition. This is an American first edition here of Screwtape. Someday I'll get my hands on a British first edition, and we'll mortgage the house to do it. But this is actually a 20th printing in the year 1952, which is when it was collated and put together, which tells you something. If they had to go through 20 printings of this first edition in the first year, that tells you something about how it was selling in America. But he actually dedicates it to none other than J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, Tolkien would not have had a high opinion of the literary prowess of this particular work by Lewis. You know, we talked last fall about Tolkien's less than enthusiastic approval of the Chronicles of Narnia. He couldn't make sense of why in the Chronicles of Narnia it seemed, as he would have said, slapdash, as Michael Ward says, it seemed so haphazard. You know, why do you have Father Christmas showing up, for instance, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? Why do you have all these different themes from different worlds coming into play in the Chronicles of Narnia? Well, similarly, he wouldn't have thought of the Screwtape letters as the finest of Lewis's literary output, nor would Lewis, and yet it was to Tolkien that Lewis dedicated the Screwtape letters. Now, Tolkien, of course, you'll recall last fall, Tolkien was a big fan of things like Out of the Silent Planet, which is the first of the Ransom series. In fact, in some ways, Tolkien was responsible for Out of the Silent Planet getting published to begin with. And so Out of the Silent Planet, Perelandra, That Hideous Strength, the Inklings all knew what Lewis was capable of, and yet the man on the street, it was this. It was mere Christianity. And then eventually for children, it was the Chronicles of Narnia. But Lewis actually gives us the genesis of this book. He writes a letter to his brother Warnie. Now, in May of 1949, Warnie had been evacuated from Dunkirk. So these are real-time historical things going on. He'd been evacuated from Dunkirk. So if you think about the movie Dunkirk and the soldiers coming out of there, Warnie would have been one of them, and he was stationed at Winvo Camp in Cardiff, Wales. And he got a letter at the camp there from Lewis, and this was July 20th on a Sunday evening. And the night before Lewis wrote this letter, he and their doctor friend, Dr. R.E. Humphrey Havard, had listened to a very persuasive speaker on the radio. Now again, what's the day here? This would have been July 19th. Of 1940, that they heard this very persuasive speaker on the radio. And Lewis writes to his brother Warnie and says, and I quote, "I don't know if I'm weaker than other people, but it is a positive revelation to me how, while the speech lasts, it is impossible not to waver just a little. I should be useless as a schoolmaster or policeman. Statements which I know to be untrue all but convince me, at any rate for the moment, if only the man says them unflinchingly." Who was that man who was speaking so unflinchingly and persuasively to the point that Lewis was unnerved? Anybody want to take a guess? Hitler. Hitler. So in some ways, listening to this speech by Hitler on the 19th of July, along with their doctor, listen to this on the radio. He pens this letter to Warnie and says, "This was very unsettling to me. This man speaks so persuasively, so decidedly." So on the next day, which was Sunday, the 21st of July of 1940, Lewis goes to Trinity Church there in Oxford, just a short walk really from his house. This is the path he would have walked. You turn right around here into the church. He and Warnie would have gone in and out that archway thousands of times over the years, and he goes to a communion service on Sunday at Holy Trinity Church in Headington Quarry. Then he continues this letter to Warnie. He said, "Before the service was over, one could wish these things came more seasonably. I was struck by an idea for a book which I think might be both useful and entertaining. It would be called As One Devil to Another." So this book was originally going to be called As One Devil to Another. And it would consist of letters from an elderly retired devil to a young devil who has just started work on his first patient. The idea would be to give all the psychology of temptation from the other point of view. And so this idea came to Lewis while he's here, sitting, I thought, where I'm sitting right here. I did my research. We went over there last summer 24, and I wanted to sit in the pew that Lewis and Warnie sat in. I thought I had found it. On further research, it's not this one, it's actually this one. I knew it was right by a column, so he could kind of stay hidden out of view, but have a good view of the pulpit. It actually was not this one, but this one right here. So I'm lecturing over in London in the spring of 27, and so Diane's going to have to make sure I get back to Oxford so I can get another picture, this time sitting in that pew right there, because that's where he was sitting. But that's where the idea came to Lewis for a book, As One Devil to another. And in this, he was going to focus on things like temptation and prayer and the struggles of the Christian life and the way that a young devil, kind of a young upstart devil, could prevent someone from becoming a Christian, or if after they had become a Christian, causing them to just give up on it entirely. And so he talks about things like prayer. On the one hand, let your patient pray. If they pray and what they ask for doesn't work out, well, then that will just convince them that prayer doesn't work and they can't believe in God. Or on the other hand, let it work out, let them pray, and if it works out, they'll just tell themselves it was just basically coincidence. The goal is to convince the patient that prayer is basically just self-hypnosis. It's just, you're just talking to yourself, it's just self-talk, and it really has no connection with any sort of divine. Either way, prayer can be nullified. Prayer can be discredited, whether it works or it doesn't. And he also was very, very quick to say, don't get too embroiled with your patient in argument. Don't have them think too much. Because if they start thinking, they might become a Christian. If you start reasoning with them and they start reading and dangerous things like that, they may become a Christian. Make sure to focus on their feelings. And we'll kind of look at a few letters here, and this will make sense, I think, here in a bit. Now, we don't really know fully how long it took him to write all of the letters. However, they did start appearing in an Anglican weekly newspaper called The Guardian. And The Guardian, they had published a couple of his things previously, and so they struck up a deal to pay him £2 per letter. And so this book that, well, in the American edition, by, at least before 52 was out, they had printed at the very least 20 printings of this in 1 year. This book, which has sold millions upon millions of copies over the years, he got £2 a letter for each one of the letters. And yet he refused to take the £2. In fact, he said, instead of paying me, just give it to widows and orphans. And he eventually started a thing called the Agape Fund, which provided for widows and orphans most of his royalties. Lewis did not die a wealthy man by any stretch. He could have. But as you recall last fall, he was fairly regularly in some worry about financial matters, and that's because he sort of apportioned off so much of his royalties from his many writings to the Agape Fund. But more than likely, the whole of it was finished by Christmas of 1940. And so this means then that Screwtape was in existence, at least in progress, before any of the 4 series of broadcast talks. We talked last week, before there was Mere Christianity, there was a series of talks that he gave on the BBC. And this is a first edition of the first series of broadcast talks. It's a British first edition of the broadcast talks. And so Screwtape was actually in progress, maybe even finished, before, certainly before all of what would eventually become Mere Christianity was completed. And now he wants to go after dualism, the prevailing notion that basically God and the devil are equal but opposite powers, but the emphasis on equality. Equal but opposed powers. And so he said there are 2 equal and opposite errors into which our race can fall about the devils. One is to disbelieve in their existence. The other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. They themselves are equally pleased by both errors, and hail a materialist or a magician with the same delight. What's he saying there? Whether someone is an atheistic Darwinian materialist, they don't believe in the spiritual realm at all, they don't believe in devils. He says the devils love that. Or someone who's overly obsessed and fearful of the demonic realm and looks for a devil around every corner, the devils are equally satisfied with that. Either way, they win, is what he's saying. And so he wants to kind of upend this notion of dualism, that God and the devil are equal but opposed powers. He ends up saying of writing Screwtape that he has never had such a hard time writing a book. He thought it was going to be kind of a fun process, kind of a fun idea. I mean, there he sits, back there, and the idea comes to him while the sermon is taking place, and his mind is kind of going elsewhere, and he comes up with his idea. Just a couple more pictures here. This is the inside of his church there. This would have been the aisle he would have walked down to get to his pew. But, and of course, there is how you get to his grave, right up there in the church cemetery yard. But he ends up saying about the writing of Screwtape that it was not fun by any stretch. Though I had never written anything more easily, I never wrote with less enjoyment. Though it was easy to twist one's mind into the diabolical attitude, it was not fun, or not for long. The strain produced a sort of spiritual cramp. The world into which I had to project myself while I spoke through Screwtape was all dust, grit, thirst, and itch. Every trace of beauty, freshness, and geniality had to be excluded. So even to write something that is really rather simple compared to much of Lewis's literary corpus, he had to sort of embody the devil. He had to get into that character and think like a devil would think. And so the question then is, well, what did Lewis actually believe about the devil? Now, in the preface to a later edition, he says, now, if by the devil you mean a power opposite to God and like God, self-existent from all eternity, the answer is certainly no. There is no uncreated being except God. God has no opposite. No being could attain a perfect badness opposite to the perfect goodness of God. For when you have taken away every kind of good thing, intelligence, will, memory, energy, and existence itself, there would be none of Him left. So that's a really strong doctrine of God. You can't have God and sort of sub-God. If there is anything that makes God God, and of course God is His attributes. He is simple. He's not sort of and this is just basic, Reformed doctrine of God. God is not a mixture of, say, love and grace and justice and omnipotence and maybe a little bit of omnipresence. If God is a composite of His attributes, then God can't be God. Why? Because if He's a composite of His attributes would have to have pre-existed God before they were composited to make up God. Secondly, a personal being would have had to have composited them, and so God wouldn't be God again. So God is His attributes. But if you take anything that is God away and make it a little less good, a little less whatever, then God is not God. And so God has no opposite. God has no equal. And yet, what does he believe? The proper question is whether I believe in devils. I do. That is to say, I believe in angels, and I believe that some of these, by the abuse of their free will, have become enemies to God, and as a corollary to us. These we may call devils. They do not differ in nature from good angels, but their nature is depraved. Devil is the opposite of angel, only as bad man is the opposite of good man. Satan, the leader or dictator of devils, is the opposite not of God, but of Michael, the archangel. So this is going to become important because later Lewis is going to write another series of letters, this between angels, just like this is between devils, and that's letters to Malcolm chiefly on prayer. And this is actually a British first edition of that book, and this book actually Lewis, and this is actually an actual what's called a 1-1, a first edition, first printing, but it was published in 1964. Now you'll remember that Lewis died November 22nd, 1963, the same day as JFK and Huxley. So the same day that Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, John F. Kennedy down at Dealey Plaza, and Lewis, November 22nd, 1963. Well, this actually had not gone to press when Lewis died, and was actually published posthumously or after Lewis died in 1964. Y'all can come check these out if you would like, but that's a British first edition. This is kind of the sequel to Screwtape Letters. And as concerned as Lewis is about prayer throughout his life. But as concerned as he's about prayer in the Screwtape letters, this is a book devoted to prayer, letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer. So you can check that out when we're finished. But the other thing that he believed was not just in devils, but in hell. And he said, hell is a bureaucracy. Maybe some of you would agree. He said, I live in the managerial age, in a world of admin. The greatest evil is not now done in these sordid dens of crime that Dickens loved to paint. It is not done even in concentration camps and labor camps. It is conceived and ordered in clean, carpeted, warmed, and well-lighted offices by quiet men with white collars and cut fingernails and smooth-shaven cheeks who do not need to raise their voice. Hence, naturally enough, my symbol for hell is something like the bureaucracy of a police state or the offices of a thoroughly nasty business concern. And so what you have here is you have the elder devil talking to his underling, coaching him along the way, but Lewis kind of paints this as this big bureaucracy. And if you've read That Hideous Strength, you know that what ultimately ends up happening is a giant bureaucracy called nice comes into play to try to put into execution the overthrow of humanity, and really the doing away with what Schaeffer would have called the mannishness of man, so that ultimately we can just be disembodied, like just basically disembodied heads that have tubes running to them, supplying oxygen and blood, and we take man to the next evolutionary stage. But of course, all that is just shrouded in bureaucracy and all kinds of political intrigue and so forth. So what I want to do is go through some of the letters. Now, did any of you bring a copy of Screwtape with you? We got some. I don't know. We got a few copies over here that Ken would probably be willing to let you thumb through if you're very gentle with them, or you could buy a copy of Screwtape. And if you don't have it, it would be a great night to do that. But I'm not going to have time to get through. There are 31 letters in all, and again, these came out weekly, and for $2 a piece or £2 a piece. And he gave all that money away, but there are 31 of them in all. So we're not going to have time to get through all 31 tonight. And in some ways, rather than me just kind of giving a 35,000 feet overview of all 31 letters, it's better for us to just listen to Lewis and let me make a few comments along the way that would kind of explain some of what is going on. So if you have your copy of Screwtape, and what I need is like to smoke my pipe right now. I need to be able to just smoke my pipe. I love the first letter. And again, you may have a letter that you want to read and talk through, which would be fine. But I love the first letter because in some ways it sets the stage for kind of methodologically what Screwtape is, what he's up to, and the way he's going to coach his nephew Wormwood. So even that name wormwood actually comes from the Old English word vermod, which is a plant, kind of a bush that has a very bitter taste to it. So you'll remember from last semester, Lewis and Tolkien were both great aficionados of Old English. And I don't know if any of you tried to learn Old English. I'm trying to learn that right now, and I thought, well, hey, Old English can't be that hard. It's just an older form. No, it's actually a foreign language. It really is. It's in some way in some ways it's harder even than Latin. I feel like, because it just seems so unfamiliar. But anyway, wormwood is from this Old English word that is a word for a very bitter bush, and he actually first mentions wormwood in the Pilgrim's Regress. And here's a piece from a poem. Thou only art alternative to God, O dark and burning island among spirit, tenth hierarch, wormwood, immortal Satan, Ahriman alone, second to him to whom no second else were known. And so he assigns this title of wormwood to Satan, and then Screwtape to the younger junior devil. So, my dear Wormwood, and by the way, have any of you gone to see the two-person play of Screwtape letters? It comes around about every 3 or 4 years at TPAC. if you ever have the opportunity to go watch this play, it's just two actors. And I thought to myself, I don't know what this is going to be like to sit through a couple hours of just two people, doing this show. It was riveting. It was absolutely riveting. So if you ever have the opportunity to go see it. So, my dear Wormwood, this is letter number 1. I know what you say about guiding your patient's reading and taking care that he sees a good deal of his materialist friend. Now, what's a materialist? A Darwinian atheist. We start at nothing, we end at nothing. We're just accidental, random byproducts of unguided evolution. That's what a materialist, all that exists is matter in motion. Okay? So I know what you say about guiding your patient's reading. Now, you may recall last semester when we went through Surprised by Joy, that in Surprised by Joy, he says, a young man, this is his own testimony, Lewis's own testimony, a young man who wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful of his reading. Okay? So one of the things that that Screwtape wants to make sure that Wormwood does not allow his patient to do is think too much, read too much, or interact with other Christians. Because Lewis himself read a lot, and he read the Bible, and he hung out with Christians like Tolkien and Dyson, and look what happened to him. He got caught up in the net of the Holy Spirit, as he would say. I know what you say about guiding your patient's reading and taking care that he sees a good deal of his materialist friend. But are you not being a trifle naive? It sounds as if you suppose that argument was the way to keep him out of the enemy's clutches. Now, there was a letter that Warney had written in 1940, about the same time as all this is going on, that there were some kind of early drafts of the Screwtape letters, and Lewis wrote of the enemy as whom? Who is the enemy? God. Yeah, God. More specifically, the incarnate Christ is the enemy, and in there he says there are these other two persons you've got to be worried about, the Father and the Holy Spirit. But he says that Lewis had said, in attacking the faith, I should be chary of argument. So Lewis writes this to Warney. In attacking the faith, and he's kind of laying out for Warney this idea that he has, right? In attacking the faith, I should be chary of argument or wary of argument. Arguments only provoke answers. What you want to work away at is the mere unreasonable feeling that, quote, that sort of thing can't really be true. What's he saying there? Can y'all hear me in the back, or maybe would it help if I use this? So what's Lewis saying here? He's saying, I want to paint Screwtape as one who wants to keep Wormwood away from argumentation or letting his patient get into arguments about whether or not Christianity is true. Because if you start arguing about it, you seek answers. If you seek answers, you might just find them, and then he'll convert. We've got to focus on just keeping him in the realm of emotion, of feeling like these things can't be true, rather than thinking them through. Okay? So methodologically, that's at the very outset. So it sounds as if you supposed, Wormwood, that argument was the way to keep him out of the enemy's clutches. That might have been so if he had lived a few centuries earlier. Why is that? Because there was a time when people thought, and they debated, and they believed in things like logic and argumentation. He says, that's not the way it is now. That might have been so if he'd lived a few centuries earlier. At that time, humans still knew pretty well when a thing was proved and when it was not. And if it was proved, they really believed it. They still connected thinking with doing and were prepared to alter their way of life as a result of a chain of reasoning. But what with the weekly press and other such weapons, we have largely altered that. I mean, what would he say today? The fact that our algorithms change every 15 minutes and define us and define reality. I mean, even with AI, kids here in the academy, you watch a video. The first question now about any video you see on Instagram is not, did I like it? Did I not like it? Was it funny? Was it sad? Was it shocking? The first question you ask is, was it AI? Was it real? Yeah. Right. So we really are experiencing ourselves a sea change right now, because what social media has brought us to the place of is questioning whether even what we see can be trusted. Okay. So what would what would he think now? So they were still connecting thinking with doing, altering their life if they were convinced by reasoning. But what with the weekly press and other such weapons, we have largely altered that. Your man has been accustomed ever since he was a boy to have a dozen incomparable philosophies dancing about together inside his head. He doesn't think of doctrines as primarily true or false, but as academic or practical, outworn or contemporary, conventional or ruthless. Now listen to this. Jargon, not argument, is your best ally in keeping him from the church. Don't waste time trying to make him think that materialism is true. Make him think that it is strong or stark or courageous, that it is the philosophy of the future. That's the sort of thing that he cares about. Now, just as a little bit of a background, you remember we talked some last semester about Friedrich Nietzsche, the great German atheistic philosopher. He lived from 1844 to 1900. And of course, Friedrich Nietzsche, being a materialist, an atheist, there's no meaning to life. He was a nihilist, from the Latin nihil, meaning nothing. We start at nothing, we end at nothing. Everything in between is nothing. We are nothing. There's nothing but nothingness. Everything is meaningless and nihil, nothing, pointlessness. And so what we have to do in this meaningless world in which we live is just pursue power. That's all that's left to us. It's not a question of is something true or false, beautiful or ugly. Is it moral or immoral? None of those things pertain. It's just power. It is just about courage. And of course, Nietzsche talked about the Übermensch. I give you the Übermensch, the overman, the superman. You must rise to the next phase of human evolution and become the Übermensch, or the overman. And so Lewis is saying, or Screwtape is saying to Wormwood, don't let your patient be too caught up in whether Christianity is true or not. Let him see it as outdated. And don't ask him to question whether or not materialism is true. Have him feel like it's courageous to be a materialist. Then you're well on your way. The trouble about argument is that it moves the whole struggle onto the enemy's own ground. Isn't that an incredible statement? Argument, reasoning, will move the game onto our enemy's ground. He can argue too. Whereas in really practical propaganda of the kind I am suggesting, he has been shown for centuries to be greatly the inferior of our Father below. Right? Jesus traffics in truth. The devil is the father of lies or propaganda or spin. Right? By the very act of arguing, you awake the patient's reason. And once it is awake, who can foresee the result? Even if a particular train of thought can be twisted so as to end in our favor, you will find that you have been strengthening in your patient the fatal habit of attending to universal issues and withdrawing his attention from the stream of immediate sense experiences. Now that's going to come up in the rest of the letters here, where he talks about pleasure. Pleasure is a good thing. We're created for pleasure, and there are legitimate pleasures. But you need to get your patient so caught up in pleasure that he sees the whole meaning of life, sensory pleasure. Okay, so he's laying some groundwork for what's going to come later in the letters. Your business is to fix his attention on the stream. Tell him to call it, quote, real life, and don't let him ask what he means by real. Remember, he is not like you, a pure spirit. Never having been a human, oh, that abominable advantage of the enemies, he says, in parentheses. Remember, he is not like you, a pure spirit, he says to Wormwood. Never having been a human, oh, that abominable advantage of the enemies, right? Because the enemy became incarnate. You don't realize how enslaved they are to the pressure of the ordinary. I once had a patient, a sound atheist, who used to read in the British Museum. Now, the British Museum was established in 1753, and it had a reading room in the center of it. I'm reading a book right now called Papyrus. It's translated from the Spanish, And it's actually just about the history of books and the history of libraries, and the way that the ancient libraries were not just places where you had to go be quiet. Like, you remember growing up in school, and the one thing you could not do in the library was talk. I remember at McLean Elementary School, when I grew up, the first library I ever encountered was McLean Elementary School. And when I was in first grade, I was taken into, on the third floor of McLean Elementary School. This building was built in 23-24. It's no longer there, but up on the third floor was the library. And I remember like it was a month ago when I first walked into the library. It was much like Beauty and the Beast and Belle walking into the Beast's library. And it was like heaven on earth for her. Well, that's what it was like to me walking in the library. But I remember Mrs. Greer, who was the librarian. She had this enormous helmet of a bouffant hair that was concretized in place. I mean, her Aquanet bill must have been through the roof. And she reminded me of Roz. You remember Monsters, Inc.? You remember Roz? I'm always watching, Wazowski. Always watching. That's kind of the way she talked. And she talked like that because she would smoke Virginia Slims. I don't know if you remember Virginia Slim, the brown cigarettes that women smoke. And she'd be back in the workroom, and when you'd go into the library, she wouldn't smoke around us, but she'd be smoking in the workroom, and we'd go in to see her just kind of leaning up against the wall, just pulling. And she had this flourish in the way she would work those Virginia Slims. And you'd go in, ring the bell. I'll be right with you, honey. It's exactly what she sounded like. But the one thing you couldn't do in the library, she would not let you get away with. She could smoke, but you couldn't speak. I mean, that was just it. She could smoke, but you couldn't speak. But the libraries, the ancient world, even into the time of the Enlightenment with the British library, would have reading rooms. Now, the British library eventually did have a reading room built into it, not when it was first built, but eventually did have a reading room built into it. And this was a place where you didn't have to be stone cold quiet. You could converse, you could talk, you could reason through the things you were reading. And so that's why Lewis is saying here, I once had a patient, a sound atheist, who used to read in the British Museum. One day, as he sat reading, I saw a train of thought in his mind beginning to go the wrong way. The enemy, of course, was at his elbow in a moment. Before I knew where I was, I saw my 20 years' work beginning to totter. If I had lost my head and begun to attempt a defense by argument, I should have been undone. But I was not such a fool. I struck instantly at the part of the man which I had best under my control and suggested it was just about time he had some lunch. The enemy presumably made the counter-suggestion. You know how one can never quite overhear what he says to them. That this was more important than lunch. At least I think that must have been his line, for when I said quite, in fact, much too important to tackle at the end of a morning, the patient brightened up considerably, and by the time I had added, much better come back after lunch and go into it with a fresh mind, he was already halfway to the door. Once he was in the streets, the battle was won. I showed him a newsboy shouting the midday paper and a number 73 bus going past. And before he had gone very far, I had got him in an unalterable conviction that whatever odd ideas might come into a man's head when he was shut up alone with his books, a healthy dose of real life, by which he meant the bus and the newsboy, was enough to show him that that sort of thing just couldn't be true. He knew he had had a narrow escape, and in later years was fond of talking about, quote, that inarticulate sense for actuality, which is our ultimate safeguard against the aberrations of mere logic. He is now safe in our Father's house. Isn't that something? So he's died and gone to hell. You begin to see the point? Thanks to the process which we set at work in them centuries ago, they find it all but impossible to believe in the unfamiliar while the familiar is before their eyes. Keep pressing home on him the ordinariness of things. Above all, do not attempt to use science, I mean the real sciences, as a defense against Christianity. They will positively encourage him to think about realities he can't touch and see. There have been sad cases among the modern physicists. If he must dabble in science, keep him on economics and sociology. Don't let him get away from the invaluable real life. But the best of all is to let him read no science, but to give him a grand general idea that he knows it all and that everything he happens to have picked up in causal talk and reading is the, quote, results of modern investigation. Do remember, you are there to fuddle him. From the way some of you young fiends talk, anyone would suppose it was our job to teach. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. So what's just happened there? Don't let him be overly concerned with science, at least not the actual sciences, because if he starts thinking too much about science, then he's going to have to be able to account for science by things he can't bump into, things he can't touch and see. So think about it like this. You've heard me say before from an apologetics perspective that apart from our starting points epistemology, how we know what we know, if we don't have an epistemology that can account for reality as we experience it, we don't have a strong epistemology. So, if I am a materialist, and I'm a materialist scientist, and I believe that all that exists is matter in motion, well then the very thing that my science depends on, inductive reasoning and the regularity of nature, neither of those things are matter. I can't hold inductive logic in my hand. And so the very thing my science depends upon, inductive logic, is itself immaterial. So what Lewis is saying, if he actually starts getting into real science, he's going to have to start thinking about things he can't touch and see, things he can't pour from one test tube into another. There was a theory that came out of the Enlightenment called logical positivism. Logical positivism. That alone is true, which can be empirically verified. It was the soul of science, or the soul of scientism. That alone is true, which can be empirically verified. But what's the problem with that statement?
It denies the invisible world.
That statement denies itself. There's an internal self-destruct mechanism. That alone is true, which can be empirically verified. Well, is that statement true? Yeah. Can you empirically verify that statement? That's what Lewis is getting at here. Because if he starts thinking about science and he's thinking about things that he can touch and see and empirically verify, he's going to start thinking about, well, how can I make sense of this? I can't touch the logic I'm using. And of course, as we saw in miracles, to paraphrase what Lewis says in miracles, if you try to suggest, well, logic is material, it's just chemicals in the brain arranging themselves. Well, as Lewis, this paraphrases Lewis, if the thought that all my thoughts are just chemical actions and reactions happening in my brain, I have no reason to trust the thought that all my thoughts are just chemical actions and reactions happening in my brain. Or as he says elsewhere, if we discover that the universe has no meaning, if the universe actually has no meaning, then we should never have discovered that the universe has no meaning. Because to say the universe has no meaning is a meaning statement. If we say the universe has no meaning, we should never have come to discover the universe has no meaning. Jonathan.
So we don't think of this as happening in the secular science colleges, but I know a geologist about 15 years ago who had come to Christ because of pursuing his degree. He said to himself, I'm hearing things in biology class and physics class and my geology focus. These professors are contradicting one another in ways I can't reconcile. Mm-hmm. And he goes, I need to find a mechanism by which I can reconcile reality and reconcile the sciences. And he looked and he searched and he found the Bible, and he's a Christian today.
Yeah. It's interesting how many in universities and so forth, how many Christians on the faculty are in what we call the hard sciences. You find a lot of atheists in the soft sciences, sociology, psychology, those kind of things, but you'll find a lot of believers in the hard sciences because, as Lewis is saying, you start thinking seriously about science, real science, and then you're going to start asking questions about things you can't touch and see. In other words, you have to be able to account for inductive logic. And the only way you can account for inductive logic is the logos. The same with math. The only way you can account for deductive logic upon which math depends is the logos himself. And so Lewis is warning, or Screwtape is warning Wormwood, you're being naive. if you're going to let your patient, if you think the way at this is to have him reason his way through materialism and think about it, you're going to defeat the enemy in an argument. If you think you're going to defeat our enemy, i.e. the incarnate Christ, in an argument on the basis of reason and thinking about reality and science and these kind of things, we're putting the game on we're giving him home field advantage. In other words, you have to realize that we have to deceive. We have to sort of pull the wool over his eyes and let him think that those things really don't matter. What matters is, real life, where the newspaper boy is selling the newspaper, the bus is driving by, making sure that I get to lunch on time. Distract him with those things. Now, as we get through Screwtape Letters, as you read it, he's going to say distraction's always going to be your great asset here. Distract him with lust. Distract him with pleasures of the flesh. I mean, think about our distracted age now, right? Are any of you in here willing to admit that you have sat down thinking, I'm just going to kind of chill first. I'm just going to kind of check out for a minute. You start scrolling on Instagram, and 2 hours later, you're just like, I'm just going to chill. I'm just going to chill. You've been chilling. You're ice cold at this point. You've been chilling for 2 hours, Francis Schaeffer, Ken was talking about Schaeffer a bit ago. Years ago, I had a group from the English Library come here and speak to my Sunday school class on a Sunday morning, and they said that years ago, if you know the story of Francis and Edith Schaeffer, when L'Abri started, it really started because their daughter Grace had gone to the University of Paris and had brought home a friend who had questions about Christianity. And of course, Francis and Edith were over there doing children's evangelism. And you can actually go to the church in St. Louis to this day where he was a pastor doing a children's ministry there. I'm somewhere a few years back on my Instagram, I've got a picture standing right exactly, the little video there, a little lecture video where Schaeffer did his children's ministry. He goes over after World War II to start a children's ministry in Europe. But his daughter knew that he was good at answering questions, so she brings her friend from college over like a fall break or something well, if you have these questions, my dad's good at answering these questions, and kind of L'Abri sort of forms up out of this. For forever, people went to L'Abri, and the sort of advertisement for L'Abri was that if you are struggling with despair, that's where you go to find answers. And as Schaeffer has said, people were reading people like Nietzsche, and they were reading Albert Camus. And talk about meaninglessness. If Nietzsche was a nihilist, and you have the existential nihilists like Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, people think he was a nihilist, was actually an absurdist. So Camus, he believed, like the nihilist, we start at nothing and we end at nothing. Everything's nothing. Everything's meaningless. And yet Camus said, but why is it we so desire meaning? This is absurd. It's not just that life is meaningless. It's worse than meaningless. It's absurd, because I know life is meaningless and yet I still want meaning. And so he said the only logical solution is suicide. And so Schaeffer was right. People were coming out of despair. They were coming and finding answers. Bill Edgar talks about going to L'Abri and being discipled by Schaeffer. Jerram Bars, who taught apologetics for years at Covenant Theological Seminary, was contemplating suicide himself. He was reading Camus and Nietzsche and so forth. And he goes to L'Abri and gets introduced to Christ by Schaeffer, but people were going out of despair. Well, a few years ago, I had some folks from the English L'Abri come, and they were talking to my Sunday school class, and I had mentioned this, and I'll never forget him saying, no one comes to L'Abri because they are despairing anymore. That's not why people come. Nobody's despairing. I'm like, well, if they're not despairing, why do they come? They say they come because they're distracted. Think about that. What's possibly worse than being full of despair? Just numbing yourself out with distraction. So people are showing up at L'Abri too numb to despair. They've just anesthetized themselves with distraction. Yeah. Oh, I thought you had your hand up.
Oh, no, I didn't. Earlier, I was just going to make a comment when you were talking about.
Hey, I'm going to hand you the mic so they can hear you.
Oh, well, I was just thinking about the comment that I heard Greg Bonson make.
Yeah.
About worldviews, and said that if, for an atheist, they have to borrow from a Christian worldview to basically make their arguments, and that was all I was going to say.
Yeah. So Greg Bonson, who died in December of 1995, was a Van Tillian apologist, and he gets this from Cornelius Van Til. So Van Til, who was the founder of apologetics at Westminster Theological Seminary, spoke of what he called borrowed epistemic capital. That the atheist, anyone arguing against Christianity has to borrow the epistemological capital of Christianity in order even to mount up an argument. So if the atheist says, I'm the logical one, you as the Christian are illogical, you're the one that believes in fairy tales and unicorns, I'm the logical one, well, what is that atheist borrowing? Well, let's think about this. You're wrong for believing something that's untrue. So that's moral capital. Well, if I'm truly a materialist, what is morality other than just a consensus maxim? An opinion that we've codified into some kind of utilitarian, ethic. If I assume that my statement, you believe in fairy tales, actually means you believe in fairy tales, I'm assuming objectivity in predication and word meaning. Well, if I'm a materialist, what's a word? What's a word or a string of words we call a sentence? Just airwaves moving a little bone in your ear, firing off material signals and chemicals in your brain. What's a word? A universal. I'm having to assume that which only Christianity can account for, even to say that it's wrong for you to believe it, to say that you are foolish for believing it. And if I say I'm the logical one, and what is logic? Inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. Well, if I'm a materialist and all that exists is matter, well, guess what isn't material? Logic. Greg Bahnsen did The Great Debate. Sometime go online and look up The Great Debate, Greg Bahnsen, Bahnsen. This debate was 1985 at UC, at the University of California, one of their branch campuses. And he debated Gordon Stein, who at the time was the president of the American Association of Atheists. And Gordon Stein comes out and basically attacks all of the traditional proofs of the existence of God. Thomas's five ways, Anselm's ontological argument. And he basically was about to drop his mic like he'd had a mic drop moment. And Greg Bahnsen, the Van Tillian Reformed apologist, catches the mic and says, I couldn't agree with you more. I'm not going to argue according to the traditional proofs. I'm going to argue according to the transcendental argument. And it was just a cat and mouse game. And this is a spoiler, but in the very end, he managed to get Gordon Stein backed into a corner so that Stein said, you believe in a God who is immaterial. And since he's immaterial, he can't be seen, he can't be experienced. There's nothing else. To name one other thing that we believe in that is immaterial. And this is, of course, after Gordon Stein had been making the case that he was the logical one. And Bahnsen said, the laws of logic. And the whole crowd started laughing, and the debate was over at that moment, because Stein realized that the premise of his argument being the only thing that is true is that which we can experience by the senses or empirically verify. And when Bahnsen kind of backed him into a corner and said, well, the laws of logic are not material, his whole argument was completely undone. Then after this, there was an atheist apologist just a couple of months later named Michael Martin. So that was called the Transcendental Argument for the Existence of God, TAG. So Michael Martin came up with the TANG, the Transcendental Argument for the Non-Existence of God. And he said, I see what that Reformed Calvinist is doing. He is appealing to the laws of logic. I will come up with the TANG, the Transcendental Argument for the Non-Existence of God. And what he did was essentially saw the branch off the tree that he was sitting on, because he said, if you're going to depend on the laws of logic in order to argue for the existence of God, well, guess what? The laws of logic are not objectively true. So you're wanting to try to defeat the transcendental argument for the existence of God so badly that you're willing to give up the very possibility of meaning itself. And he couldn't at the time realize that denying the objectivity of the laws of logic, they were no longer laws of logic. They were just subjective consensus maxims. Anyway, that's kind of where Lewis is causing Screwtape to go with Wormwood and prepare him for what's ahead. Now, I wish we could just go through every single letter. We're not going to have time to do that, but if I can, let me read a little bit from the second letter. This is good, and I think you'll relate to this. This is going to kind of hit home. This is going to hit home for us. Maybe a little too close for comfort for some of us, but I would dare say that you've actually probably heard preachers quote from this letter. So this is letter number 2, and this comes out a week later. So this is May 9th, 1941 in The Guardian. My dear Wormwood, I note with grave displeasure that your patient has become a Christian. Do not indulge. So what's happened? Within one letter, poor Wormwood, already the patient has become a Christian. But Screwtape saying, don't give up hope yet. We can talk him out of it. I note with grave displeasure that your patient has become a Christian. Do not indulge the hope that you will escape the usual penalties. Indeed, in your better moments, I trust you would hardly even wish to do so. In the meantime, we must make the best of the situation. There is no need to despair. Hundreds of these adult converts have been reclaimed after a brief sojourn in the enemy's camp and are now back with us. All the habits of the patient, both mental and bodily, are still in our favor. So we're still fallen, right? And so he's saying, look, he's not in heaven yet. He's not sanctified. He's not fully sanctified yet. There's still hope. One of our great allies at present is the church itself. Do not misunderstand me. I do not mean the church as we see her spread through all time and space and rooted in eternity, terrible as an army with banners. That, I confess, is a spectacle which makes our boldest tempters uneasy, but fortunately is quite invisible to these humans. All your patient sees is the half-finished sham Gothic erection on the new building estate. When he goes inside, he sees the local grocer with rather an oily expression on his face, bustling up to offer him one shiny little book. Of course, this is the Book of Common Prayer that Lewis will be talking about, containing a liturgy which neither of them understands, and one shabby little book containing corrupt texts of a number of religious lyrics, mostly bad and in very small print. So this would be a hymnal. When he gets to his pew and looks round him, he sees that just that selection of his neighbors whom he has hitherto avoided. You want to lean pretty heavily on those neighbors. Make his mind flit to and fro between an expression like, quote, the body of Christ and the actual faces in the next pew. It matters very little, of course, what kind of people that next pew really contains. You may know one of them to be a great warrior on the enemy's side. No matter. Your patient, thanks to our Father below, is a fool. Provided that any of those neighbors sing out of tune or have boots that squeak or double chins or odd clothes, the patient will quite easily believe that their religion must therefore somehow be ridiculous. At his present stage, you see, he has an idea of Christians in his mind which he supposes to be spiritual, but which in fact is largely pictorial. His mind is full of togas and sandals and armor and bare legs, and the mere fact that the other people in church wear modern clothes is a real, though of course an unconscious difficulty to him. So he's a Christian now, he's going to church, but he has in his mind that Christians are these sort of half angelic, very sanctified looking beings from all the old medieval art. And he's going to go to church, and there's going to be somebody wearing ragged clothes, or their boots squeak, or they got double chins, and it's going to disillusion him, is what he's saying. Never let it come to the surface. Never let him ask what he expected them to look like. Keep everything hazy in his mind now, and you will have all eternity wherein to amuse yourself by producing in him the peculiar kind of clarity which hell affords. Work hard then on the disappointment or anticlimax which is certainly coming to the patient during his first few weeks as a churchman. The enemy allows this disappointment to occur on the threshold of every human endeavor. It occurs when the boy who has been enchanted in the nursery by stories from the Odyssey buckles down to really learning Greek. It occurs when lovers have got married and begin the real task of learning to live together. In every department of life, it marks the transition from dreaming aspiration to laborious doing. So he said, look, this guy has this kind of elevated, idealistic view of church, and everybody he's going to encounter there look like these angelic, Christians that he sees in paintings and so forth. And it's like a child who was raised on selections from the Odyssey who then actually has to learn Greek. And he becomes bored with it or disillusioned with it, or two young lovers who are madly in love. They get married and they realize marriage is harder than they thought. So this disappointment is going to work to our advantage. The enemy takes this risk because he has a curious fantasy of making all these disgusting little human vermin into what he calls his free lovers and servants. Sons is the word he uses. So our enemy, Christ, has this fantasy notion that he's going to take these rats and make of them daughters and sons. Isn't that an incredible thing? So his free lovers, his sons, his servants, with his inveterate love of degrading the whole spiritual world by unnatural liaisons with the two-legged animals. So they're just animals, and our enemy wants to populate heaven with them. Desiring their freedom, he, our enemy, therefore refuses to carry them by their mere affections and habits to any of the goals which he sets before them. He leaves them to do it on their own, and there lies our opportunity. But also remember, there lies our danger. If once they get through this initial dryness successfully, they become much less dependent on emotion and therefore much harder to tempt. I've been writing hitherto on the assumption that the people in the next pew afford no rational ground for disappointment. Of course, if they do, if the patient knows that the woman with the absurd hat is a fanatical bridge player, or the man with squeaky boots, a miser and an extortioner, then your task is so much the easier. All you then have to do is to keep out of his mind the question, if I, being what I am, can consider that I am in some sense a Christian, why should the different vices of those people in the next pew prove that their religion is mere hypocrisy and convention? You may ask whether it is possible to keep such an obvious thought from occurring even to a human mind. It is, Wormwood, it is. Handle him properly and it simply won't come into his head. He has not been anything like long enough with the enemy to have any real humility yet. What he says, even on his knees, about his own sinfulness is all parrot talk. At bottom, he still believes he has run up a very favorable credit balance in the enemy's ledger by allowing himself to be converted, and thinks that he is showing great humility and condescension in going to church with these smug, commonplace neighbors at all. Keep him in that state of mind as long as you can. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. Now, in Mere Christianity, in Book 3, Chapter 12, and we talked about Mere Christianity the last couple of weeks, Lewis says, as long as a man is thinking of claims and counterclaims between himself and God, he is not yet in the right relation to him. He is misunderstanding what he is and what God is, and he cannot get into the right relation until he has discovered the fact of our bankruptcy. So, Screwtape is saying to Wormwood, this new convert probably still has a pretty high estimation of his own spiritual worthiness. Use that to your advantage. Cause him to be judgmental toward those other disappointing people in the pew with him, and see if you can work that against him. Letter, well, I don't even know where to leave off and where to read and where not to read in here. Do any of y'all have a particular letter or a particular passage from a letter that you want to draw attention to? Yeah. Hey, I'm gonna bring the microphone back to you. I wish we had our coffee shop set up like we did a couple of weeks ago in here. It'd be much better. And which letter are you going to read to us from?
So this is from letter 4, where Lewis makes a point about prayer specifically that
Yes.
I think he would agree can be broadly applied to the Christian life. It's just starting in the second paragraph of letter 4. The best thing, where it is possible, is to keep the patient from the serious intention of praying altogether. When the patient is an adult, recently reconverted to the enemy's party, like your man, this is best done by encouraging him to remember, or to think he remembers, the parrot-like nature of his prayers in childhood. In reaction against that, he may be persuaded to aim at something entirely spontaneous, inward, informal, and unregularized. And what this will actually mean to a beginner will be an effort to produce in himself a vaguely devotional mood in which real concentration of will and intelligence have no part. That mood, that feeling, that sense of devotion, and that pursuit of that on its own as an end of itself,
Yeah.
I think is poisonous to the church. I think it is something we really do experience by God's grace when we truly worship, when we truly pray, when we truly study. But we worship it, and we make it an end of itself, and we hallucinate it. We create it inorganically, and we think that we're close to God. And in fact, we're just pleasing ourselves. And I think that's what Lewis is getting at here.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that out, because letter 4 is largely, it's about prayer, and several of the letters are, and of course the whole of letters to Malcolm are about prayer. And Lewis draws an episode from his childhood when it comes to the feelings that we feel like we have to sort of churn up in prayer in order to make our prayers valid. And we do this in a lot of ways. We do it when we come to the sacraments. When I come to the table, was I really feeling it when I came to the Lord's table this morning? Was I really sincere and focused when I came to the Lord's table? Or was I kind of checked out or distracted, or I didn't really get a vibe this morning when I came to the Lord's table? Well, maybe the sacrament is of no value, of no use. And we're the same way with prayer. Have you ever prayed before and just not felt really engaged in your prayer? Any of you? Am I the only one in here that's ever experienced that? So Lewis draws an episode from his childhood, and this is in Letters to Malcolm. In Letters to Malcolm, and also in Surprised by Joy, he talks about this. Later in life, in Letters to Malcolm, he said, "We must not encourage ourselves or others any tendency to work up such a subjective state, which, if we succeeded, we should describe as faith, with the idea that this will somehow ensure the granting of our prayer. We have probably all done this as children, but the state of mind which desperate desire working on a strong imagination can manufacture is not faith in the Christian sense. It is a feat of psychological gymnastics." So he's saying, don't sort of gaslight yourself, as it were, into thinking that, well, if I can work up a really emotional fervor while I'm praying, that's real faith. That's real faith. And he talks about in Surprised by Joy, you remember last semester when we talked about his mother getting sick with cancer. And so he determined as a little boy, and this is one of the things that led to his atheism. He determined as a little boy, if I pray with enough faith and enough sincerity, she's going to be healed. He said in Surprised by Joy, this is in chapter 1, "When her case was pronounced hopeless, I remembered what I had been taught, that prayers offered in faith would be granted. I accordingly set myself to produce by willpower a firm belief that my prayers for her recovery would be successful." So Lewis is saying, if we think our prayer life and the effectiveness of prayer itself is somehow wed to our emotional engagement or our emotional fervency or some sort of feeling that we're churning up makes our prayer more of a prayer. He said we need to let go of that and realize that it is the one to whom we are praying that makes our prayers effective, not our feelings that we're trying to churn up in the midst of it. But of course, in this letter, which I'm not going to take the time to read the whole letter, but he's saying, look, if you can just convince your patient that his prayers, that if he's not feeling it, well, none of this must be real. Confuse him in the realm of prayer. Confuse him in the realm of prayer. Now, there's an old story of C.S. Lewis and David Martin Lloyd-Jones, the great Welsh preacher, being on a boat. They were both taking a trip together, and Lloyd-Jones asked Lewis if he was going to write, what's the next book you're going to write? And this is later in life. This was later in life. And Lewis said, I want to write a book on prayer once I think I have learned something about it. And this is after years of being a Christian. And what does he write? He writes Letters to Malcolm that's not published until the year after his death. So this is something that was basically just in a manuscript form by the time he died. But Lewis talks a lot about prayer in the Screwtape letters. I probably only have time to maybe read one more, and then we can talk about maybe a couple of other themes that you like in the letters, and then we'll finish it up next week. I'll give you an assignment. And, this one is really. So this is letter number 5. This was May 30th, 1941, in the Guardian. My dear Wormwood, it is a little bit disappointing to expect a detailed report on your work and to receive instead such a vague rhapsody as your last letter. You say you are delirious with joy because the European humans have started another of their wars. I see very well what has happened to you. You are not delirious, you are only drunk. Reading between the lines in your very unbalanced account of the patient's sleepless night, I can reconstruct your state of mind fairly accurately. For the first time in your career, you have tasted that wine which is the reward of all our labors, the anguish and bewilderment of the human soul. And it has gone to your head. I can hardly blame you. I do not expect old heads on young shoulders. Did the patient respond to some of your terror pictures of the future? Did you work in some good self-pitying glances at the happy past? Some fine thrills in the pit of his stomach were there? You played your violin prettily, did you? Well, it's all very natural, but do remember, Wormwood, that duty comes before pleasure. If any present self-indulgence on your part leads to the ultimate loss of the prey, you will be left eternally thirsting for that draught of which you are now so much enjoying your first sip. If, on the other hand, by steady and cool-headed application here and now, you can finally secure his soul, he will then be yours forever. A brimful living chalice of despair and horror and astonishment, which you can raise to your lips as often as you please. So do not allow any temporary excitement to distract you from the real business of undermining faith and preventing the formation of virtues. Give me without fail in your next letter a full account of the patient's reactions to the war so that we can consider whether you are likely to do more good by making him an extreme patriot or an ardent pacifist. There are all sorts of possibilities. In the meantime, I warn you not to hope too much from a war. Of course, a war is entertaining. The immediate fear and suffering of the humans is a legitimate and pleasing refreshment for our myriads of toiling workers. But what permanent good does it do us unless we make use of it for bringing souls to our Father below? When I see the temporal suffering of humans who finally escape us, I feel as if I had been allowed to taste the first course of a rich banquet and then denied the rest. It is worse than not to have tasted it at all. The enemy, true to his barbarous methods of warfare, allows us to see the short misery of his favorites only to tantalize and torment us, to mock the incessant hunger which during this present phase of the great conflict, his blockade is admittedly imposing. Now, the great conflict, of course, is what? World War II. And by this time, Japan nor the States had joined in. This is May 30th, 1941. And so he is going to call it here, let us therefore think rather how to use than how to enjoy this European war. Because at this point, it's just a European war. States and Japan aren't in it. For it is certain tendencies inherent in it which are in themselves by no means in our favor. We may hope for a good deal of cruelty and unchastity, but if we are not careful, we shall see thousands turning in this tribulation to the enemy, while tens of thousands who do not go so far as that will nevertheless have their attention diverted from themselves to values and causes which they believe to be higher than the self. I know that the enemy disapproves many of these causes, but that is where he is so unfair. He often makes prizes of humans who have given their lives for causes he thinks bad on the monstrously sophistical ground that the humans thought them good and were following the best they knew. Consider, too, what undesirable deaths occur in wartime. Men are killed in places where they knew they might be killed and to which they go if they are at all of the enemy's party prepared. What's he saying? One of the disadvantages of war is that men know they could die, and so they join our enemy before they go so as to be prepared. So if you're taking delight, Wormwood, in war and all the human suffering, just know it's going to cause some people to basically prepare themselves spiritually for the inevitability of death in a war. How much better for us if all humans died in costly nursing homes, amid doctors who lie, nurses who lie, friends who lie, as we have trained them, promising life to the dying, encouraging the belief that sickness excuses every indulgence, and even if our workers know their job, withholding all suggestion of a priest, lest it should betray to the sick man his true condition. So he's saying, we don't think about death, and we tell, even we are trained to tell one another, oh, you're going to be fine, you're going to be fine. And so that puts off having to think about death. War, on the other hand, you're going to die. You could die if you go to war. And so he said it would be better for us not to have wars and just let people go along, because people prepare themselves spiritually. And they join our enemy because they know they could die in a war. But if you just let them live out their lives and keep telling them, oh, you're not going to die, you're going to get better. And we keep people from thinking about the reality of death, or the old Latin phrase, memento mori, remember death, memento mori, right? Remember death. He said, this is not to our advantage. And how disastrous for us is the continual remembrance of death which war enforces. One of our best weapons, contented worldliness, is rendered useless. Isn't that an incredible statement? One of our best weapons, contented worldliness, is rendered useless. In wartime, not even a human can believe that he is going to live forever. I know that Scabtree and others have seen in wars a great opportunity for attacks on faith, but I think that view is an exaggeration. The enemy's human partisans have all been plainly told by him that suffering is an essential part of what he calls redemption, so that a faith which is destroyed by a war or a pestilence cannot really have been worth the trouble of destroying. I am speaking now of diffuse suffering over a long period, such as the war will produce. Of course, at the precise moment of terror, bereavement, or physical pain, you may catch your man when his reason's temporarily suspended. But even then, if he applies to enemy headquarters, I have found the post is nearly always defended. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. I love that last line. If he applies to enemy headquarters, if he lifts up a prayer, I have found that the enemy headquarters is nearly always defended. He's always going to be heard if he reaches out in prayer. So Lewis gave this is in The Weight of Glory. In fact, there's a picture back here on my bookshelf there that my in-laws for Christmas got for me and had it framed. And it's from In Learning in Wartime. And in Learning in Wartime, Lewis said, war makes death real to us, and that would have been regarded as one of its blessings by most of the great Christians of the past. They thought it good for us to be always aware of our mortality. I'm inclined to think they are right. He writes to Arthur Greaves. Remember his friend Arthur Greaves, who lived back in Belfast? On September 15th, 1939. Now that year should be significant for you when you understand World War II. But he writes to Greaves, quote, "The next few years will be ghastly. But though my nerves are often staggered, my faith and reason are all right. I have no doubt that all this suffering will be for our ultimate good if we use it rightly. But I can't help wishing one could hibernate till it's all over. I dare say for me, personally, it has come in the nick of time. I was just beginning to get too well settled in my profession, too successful, and probably self-complacent." So Lewis is saying complacent worldliness, contented worldliness was taking hold of me. And so even though this war is going to be ghastly and we're all going to suffer, it's going to disrupt the complacent worldliness that I was getting settled into. Anyone else? I mean, we have, just a few short minutes here. Anything else that you have seen in Screwtape that you want to draw attention to? How many of you have read Screwtape before? Yeah, probably just about everybody in the room. How many of you say it's been a while since you read Screwtape? Okay, everybody in the room pretty much, yeah. It's one of those early things we read in Lewis, and we think, okay, well, I've kind of moved on from that. I want to read Till We Have Faces now, which is a bit of a challenge, admittedly. But there's a lot of wisdom, a lot of real kind of understanding of the human condition. In other words, the only way that Wormwood, or that Screwtape could be so insightful on issues of temptation and so forth was because Lewis was such a careful student of the human person. It's kind of like Dostoevsky. You know, Dostoevsky is considered the great psychologist. You know, had this great insight into the human self. People will say the same thing about Jane Austen, and I think both of those are true. Certainly, Lewis understood the human condition, and in some ways, maybe you see it in the simplicity of Screwtape, maybe more so than anywhere else. Yeah.
One more.
Yeah. Let me bring the mic back to you.
Didn't want to take anybody else's turn, but I've got another one that I'd love to hear your comments on, because it's a fascinating thing.
Yeah, and tell us which letter. Hey.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier in letter 1, where he writes, "Your business is to fix his attention on the stream. Teach him to call it real life, and don't let him ask what he means by real."
Yeah.
That jumped off the page to me more than anything else in the first 3 letters, and I underlined it. And then I was thrilled to see that Lewis expands on that significantly towards the end. He brings it full circle in letter 30, towards the end of letter 30. So this is a little bit of a passage, but I'll read it.
Lay it on us.
It's maybe a full page or a little more before the end of the letter.
Letter 30,
Yep,
for those of
letter
you.
30. So if you look towards the end for the paragraph that starts with probably the scenes, halfway through there, he says, "You will notice that we have got them completely fogged about the meaning of the word real. They tell each other of some great spiritual experience. All that really happened was that you heard some music in a lighted building. Here, real means the bare physical facts, separated from the other elements in the experience they actually had. On the other hand, they will also say, it's all very well discussing that hideout as you sit here in an armchair, but wait till you get up there and see what it's really like. Here," and this just made me go, wait a minute, I don't think of this word correctly. I don't know what I mean by the word real. Here, real is being used in the opposite sense, to mean not the physical facts, which they know already while discussing the matter in armchairs, but the emotional effect those facts will have on a human consciousness. Either application of the word could be defended, but our business is to keep the two going at once, so that the emotional value of the word real can be placed now on one side of the account, now on the other, as it happens to suit us." And I thought, well, the God of the universe is the most real that can be conceived of, and regardless of whether it could be conceived of, because he is. He simply is. And here, our enemy, the real enemy, twists our perception, our understanding, our conception of what real means for us, what it means in our perception, what it means outside of us, to the point where we can struggle to connect with God's view of what's real to begin with.
Yeah, so
How do we think of the real? How do we make sure that what we believe, how do we make sure that we're believing rightly what real is and ought to mean?
yeah. So this is going to be a little bit of a kind of deep into the pool. But to tell you what's behind this, and I've got 4 minutes to do it. So David Hume, the great Scottish philosopher, or the great Scottish materialist atheistic philosopher, was a realist in his approach to epistemology, or how we know what we know. He was a materialist, atheist, realist. David Hume, you may recall, famously said you can't get an ought from an is. That's an ethical statement. All that there is around us are just ises. There just is. And you can't draw an ethical conclusion. You can only see what is in front of you. Similarly, you don't see causation, Hume says. So the famous illustration of if you watch a billiard table and one ball strikes another ball and knocks that ball into the corner pocket, you think you've seen causation. You haven't seen causation. You can't see causation. That's an illusion. That's a mental habit that you actually don't see causation. Just like ought. I ought to do this, I ought not to do that. That's just a mental illusion. All you saw was one billiard ball and another billiard ball, and you saw the one billiard ball strike the other billiard ball, and you think you saw causation. You didn't. You saw two billiard balls, one striking the other. He was a bald materialist, just a absolute materialist. Now, Immanuel Kant, the great Enlightenment thinker who followed on the heels of David Hume, said that Hume awakened him from his dogmatic slumber. What did he mean by dogmatic? Well, Immanuel Kant was a Lutheran philosopher. And he realized, oh my goodness, I have been lulled to sleep by the dogmatism of Christianity. And what Hume has done, Hume has won the day and shown us that what is really real, the really real, is just the material experience around us, things we can bump into, things we can see, billiard balls, or things I can touch or smell. That's real. That's the real. But he also realized, Kant, that if you go with Hume, you can't get an ought from an is, there's going to be no basis for ethics. And if you go with Hume, there will be absolutely no way to have a thing called faith in Christianity. So Immanuel Kant says essentially, well, it's true that the only thing that's really knowable and real is sense experience. But if we give up faith or we give up Christianity, we're not going to have a basis for ethics, because Hume has said there's no basis for ethics. You can't get an ought from an is. And so Kant sets out to say, I am going to save knowledge and make room for faith. I'm going to admit that what is knowable is what we can bump into and touch. The is. That's what's knowable. That's the hard scientism. That's, all right? But I'm going to make room for faith and things we can't bump into. In fact, he said you have to. Because the statement, I am standing here, for it to be a true statement, well, what am I experiencing? I am experiencing both space and time. I am standing here. I am time. Standing here, space. But guess what? I can't hold space in my hand. I can't hold time in my hand. So he says, Hume has missed something here. I can't see space. I can't see time. In fact, if I think I see space, what I'm seeing is actually not space itself, but the absence of some matter. So if I look into an empty room and say, there's a lot of space in here. Well, what I'm seeing is not space. What I'm touching is not space. What I'm bumping into is not space. I just haven't bumped into the wall yet. And so Kant says, if we say that all that is real is that which we can bump into, then we can't we can't make sense of statements like, I am standing here. Now, I can touch the floor, but I am has to do with time. Standing here has to do with space. And so Immanuel Kant said there's the phenomenal realm and the noumenal realm. In the phenomenal realm are the phenomena that we touch, that we bump into, things that we can touch, taste, see, and smell. In the noumenal realm are the things that we don't bump into. Essence, the self. The German phrase is das Ding an sich, the thing in itself. God. We can't know anything about that which is in the noumenal realm, but we must posit it there if we're to be able to make sense of, I am standing here. Think about it. I am standing here. That's a statement about self, but I can't hold self in my hand. I can't pour self from one test tube into another. I am, that's time, standing here, that's space. And so Immanuel Kant said, in the noumenal realm are things that we must hold as what he called a priori intuitions, or before the experience of bumping into something, things that we intuit. We have to posit them. Therefore, that's going to save faith. I've saved faith from the skepticism of Hume. But if all we're doing is positing as a mental intuition God in the noumenal realm, all I've done is moved God from the hardcore skepticism, denial and skepticism of Hume into the subjective, self-focused skepticism, because guess what? If God is just a postulation that I am intuiting, if I'm to make sense of something, then at the end of the day, I know in my heart, I'm the one who intuited him. And so I'm just kicking the can of skepticism down the road. Now, why that philosophy lesson? Because what Lewis is saying here, and he's ending the book with this: people have come to believe that which is real is only that which we can experience or touch or bump into. And we've got to keep people there. We've got to keep people there. What he's saying in that last letter, kind of his final words to his young nephew, don't let him question what is real. Let him just go along mindlessly thinking that what is real are the things we bump into, the bus driving by, the fact that I'm hungry. Don't let him get beyond asking questions beyond the material experience. Because if he does, he's going to run into our enemy, because only our enemy can make sense of both material experience and the things that are not part of matter. In other words, only Hebrews 1:1-3, he holds all things together by the word of his power. There's a tree out there, and every leaf right now, according to Hebrews 1, is held together by the rhema, the spoken word of the Hebrews 1:1-3, of the Logos, John 1:1. The rhema, the spoken word of the eternal word, is holding that leaf together by the word of his power. So the material is held together because of the reality of the enemy, according to, as well as the immaterial reality that must be what it is if we're to make sense of material reality. In other words, only the Logos can make sense of logic. And so that's why he's ending that way and saying, let him think he's focused on the real. And if you've convinced him that, and if his conception of the real is just that which he bumps into, and he doesn't question anything, beyond that, you're safe. Does that make sense? And so Immanuel Kant sets in motion what we live with today, which is what? And Lewis, this is in letter 30. Basically, because he says this in letter 30, the spiritual and those kind of things, that's just subjective. It's not really real. It's really a devastating way for it to end, because we all know the temptation to think, well, what's really true and real are the hard sciences. Well, yeah, they are, because God says so. But faith is just a purely subjective matter. Well, that's what Kant gave us. And Lewis is saying, let your patient think that what is real is that which he's bumping into, and matters of spirituality are just pure subjectivism. Yeah.
But how do they account for feelings? Because feelings, we talked about causation. Feelings result from something.
Yeah. So the materialist would say feeling is just a chemical, neurological reaction. And of course, but they don't live according to it. So I'll close with this. There is a man in our church who many years ago was he was doing his internship at Vanderbilt. And as a young man doing his internship at Vanderbilt, his supervisor said, you have potential to go a really long way, but you're going to have to lay off this Jesus thing. After all, what you call faith in Jesus or love for Jesus, that's just a chemical reaction in your brain. And you're staking your whole life on this feeling of love and faith that you have for Jesus. It's just a chemical reaction. And so he came to me and he said, David, this was many, many years ago. And when he was a young man, and he said, and we were both young men, and he said, I don't know how to answer that, because feelings are connected to neurological and chemical, interaction. And is that what my faith in Jesus and my love for Jesus actually is? Is it just reducible to that? And so I said, your supervisor, is he married? And he said, yeah. I said, does he love his wife? He said, well, I'm sure he does. I said, okay, well, go back to him and say, sir, you've convinced me that my faith in Jesus is just a chemical, neurological sensation. And, my love for Jesus is just a chemical, bodily sensation, a neurological sensation. But I'm almost there, but would you do me a favor, sir? Would you go home, and when you meet your wife, go in and say, honey, I love you. And when she kisses you and says, honey, I love you too, thank you for loving me, ask him to say, but oh, by the way, my love for you is basically just well, I probably can't finish this illustration. In mixed company, let me find another way to, let's do it this way. My love for you, just want you to know, is just a chemical, neurological, bodily reaction, kind of like a sneeze. I'll let you use your imagination. And it's not worth more than a sneeze. I said, is he going to say that? Well, of course, because he doesn't believe that. He doesn't actually believe that. So the materialist can account for anything that is not matter. Of course, this was a lot of Lewis's context, because think about Lewis in the 1900s. Materialism had completely taken over, England, pretty much. And so he was constantly going after the materialists. I mean, in many ways, it's what the Ransom series is about. So, and much in The Magician's Nephew is the same thing in Chronicles of Narnia. He deals with it in Mere Christianity. So for next week, here's your assignment. If you don't have Mere Christianity or Screwtape Letters, or if you've lost your copy of it, there are fresh new copies over here. 3 of them left. You can go purchase one. But read it. You actually can read the whole of Screwtape Letters in a week. Easily. You could read 2 or 3 letters in one setting. They're so short. I mean, they were just newspaper articles, little posts. Read it as much as you can, and then next week, a little less of me and a little more of you, kind of what Jonathan did. What are some of the things you've underlined? What are some of the questions you have? And we'll kind of pack in around it some of the historical, theological, philosophical context, and finish out our time. So we have one more night. We'll do Screwtape next week, and maybe I'll say just a tad or two about letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer. Maybe I'll read a letter from this to kind of contrast 2 angels talking versus 2 devils talking to one another. You can come up and look at the books if you want, or any of the rest of them back there. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you for these dear ones who come out on Thursday nights, Lord, to go a little more deeply in a man whose whole life was a pursuit of joy, and that pursuit of joy was ultimately found in a person, not just his wife, Joy, but his Savior, Jesus, in whose name we pray. Amen. Thursday night. Oh, by the way, you might want to know Malcolm Guite, who is a Lewis and Tolkien scholar. He's a British poet and so forth. He's going to be over here on Friday night, the 27th. So it's a week from tomorrow night. He's going to be at West End Community Church, a sister PCA church, West End Community Church. He is actually going to be doing a presentation there. Again, a Lewis and Tolkien scholar, a poet. He is doing a new epic in the form of Milton, and it's on Sir Galahad. The first volume is coming out in the next week or so, and he's going to be reading portions from it, doing some Q&A, and so that's one thing. And then another thing you might want to know about is this coming Tuesday night. The Veritas Forum is doing an evening with Joseph LeConte. Now, Joseph LeConte is a C.S. Lewis and Tolkien scholar in New York, and he's the one who wrote the book a couple of years ago, A Hobbit, a Wardrobe, and a Great War, on the impact of World War I on the writing of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and Narnia. Well, his second book has just come out. I think it's called The Darkening Storm, where it gets into a little more of the experience of Lewis and Tolkien in the war. Tickets for that are $15, I think. $15, and it's going to be at MBA, at Montgomery Bell Academy. And if you've ever heard him speak online or in person, he is a riveting speaker, and it would be a great way to spend a Tuesday night if you're not doing anything. But that's, I think, it's at 6 o'clock this coming Tuesday night. And then Tuesday and then Friday week is going to be Malcolm Guide at West End. So you can do 3 nights of Lewis, Tuesday night here, Thursday night, and then Friday night at West End Community Church. So thanks for coming out, y'all. Say hey to somebody you don't know.